Before we begin our episode, a brief word of caution. The topic of our conversations contained here deals with some of the most traumatic episodes of war and violence to have occurred in modern history. Some listeners may find the content disturbing or triggering, especially if they have experienced violence or trauma in their own lives. While we believe it is important to remember the lessons of war and to educate, we know that it can prove difficult to hear. Therefore, listener discretion is advised. Cześć, hello, witam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matalevich. We now welcome you to part 2 of the long echoes of the displaced. When I first started attending St. Joe's while in high school in the early 2000s, there was an older Polish gentleman who served as the sacristan and altar server. Joseph Sajecki was a reserved and kindly older man, and my mom remarked on how his accent reminded her so much of her own grandfather. Like many people you encounter in a parish family, I didn't know much about his personal history. Only that he lived here in Camden and was one of the parishioners that had immigrated sometime after the war. On one occasion during an opening prayer held before a parish society meeting held in September, someone mentioned that we should remember in a special way the invasion anniversary. The meaning of that word, invasion, of course needed no further explanation in a Polish parish. After the prayer, someone offhandedly remarked, "I'm sure Joe remembers the invasion," to which he gave a simple and silent nod. In the years since he passed in 2010, I have reflected on that moment often, wondering what that may have meant in more detail. In preparing for this episode, my thoughts turned to him once again, and so I decided to utilize my research skills, Polish genealogy and history, see if I was able to piece together a more complete story of Joe's life. Although his physical voice is now silenced, and therefore unable to be recorded like our other guests, I was surprised to see that what remained in records regarding him can be pieced together to bring another chapter of the Polish World War II story into focus that few have seen, especially here in the US. Joe, or more properly, Józef, was born on March 31st, 1922, to Jan and Maria Sajecki in the village of Wojtyłów, near Tarnopol, in today's western Ukraine. He was christened the same day. This region of Galicia had existed under Austrian control during the time of the partitions, and had come to include a mixture of ethnicities including Poles, Ruthenians, which are part-of-day modern Ukrainians, and Jews. During World War I, the area had been occupied by alternating Russian and German forces and experienced major destruction and upheaval. With the end of this war and the termination of imperial control, ensuing border skirmishes and wars erupted between these ethnic groups, left to carve out modern states to accommodate ethnic identities. The 1920s were filled with bitter conflicts between Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians, as control and definition of borders were oftentimes violently disputed. This region in question around the city of Tarnopol was one of the most contested areas. Joe would have been born into a town that had only just recently ceded to the Polish Republic a year earlier under the terms of the Treaty of Riga, which had ended the Polish-Soviet War. Although seeking to clarify the border issue following the Polish victory over Russia, the treaty was viewed as a betrayal by Ukrainian nationalists who had been promised a state of their own and instead found themselves divided between Poland and Soviet Russia. Tarnopol would exist under Polish control until the outset of World War II. The attitude of Poles toward them ranged greatly from tolerance to repression, culminating in the so-called pacification of eastern Galicia in 1930. This tumult meant that Joe's childhood would have witnessed growing unrest, violence, and animosity between Polish authorities and his Ukrainian neighbors in the lead-up to September 1939. It is a sad fact that the United States and Britain's alliance with Soviet Russia during the Second World War meant that the actions of the Russian state in the first few years of the war have been generally glossed over. And calling attention to this cannot be emphasized enough how the September invasion of Poland was not just by the Germans from the west, but the Russians from the east, at virtually the same time. Although the swift overrun of Polish territory is treated with derision and even outright mocked by popular culture, no nation stood an effective chance against this dual onslaught. As brutal as the German invasion and occupation of Western Poland was, the Russians was equally as bad, and in some ways, even worse. An example of this is found in the very area of Tarnopol we find ourselves in Joe's story. Following the invasion and occupation of the area, the Russians wasted no time in rounding up Polish intelligentsia, Ukrainian nationalists, and Jews. In the horrifying atrocities that followed, thousands were tortured, executed, or deported to the Russian interior. Murder at the hands of one adversary was replaced by another, as the later German invasion of this area, when Stalin and Hitler's alliance crumbled, led to the elimination of the area's Jewish population by the thousands, and the deportation to work camps of the Ukrainian and Polish populations. Physically, the area suffered as well, with the city of Tarnopol effectively destroyed as the German army retreated in 1944. With the end of the war, no real peace was had as Ukrainian resistance movements fought actively and underground against the Soviets. Forced population transfers of Poles from the area under Stalin's direction, with tacit approval from the Allies, virtually emptied the area of its Polish population. It is estimated that some 1.6 million Poles were relocated in this manner. Then there were what is now termed the Volhynian massacres. In the history of any conflict, the payment for short-term gains always comes due years later, and usually at a greater expense than expected. The policies of Poland towards Ukrainians during the days of the Polish Republic from 1920 onwards, combined with the purging of moderate voices during the early days of the war, meant that in the ensuing chaos of occupation, extremists found an outlet for grievances in the most horrifying manner. An insurgent army became convinced that the only way of establishing a Ukrainian state after the war was to enact their own ethnic cleansing of Poles. The horrific murder and destruction of thousands of ethnic Poles in their villages beginning in the spring of 1943 is a revolting chapter in the brutality of humanity. The ferocity of the atrocities, in which historians estimate between 30,000 to 100,000 Poles were horrifically murdered, are ones that are difficult to read and believe. Men, women, and children of all ages were savagely killed and mutilated in these attacks, demonstrating how far human beings can fall when they identify a population as the quote-unquote other. We will likely never know where Joe's story exactly fits into these tumultuous and horrific events. What is known, however, is that on one document it records that he entered Germany on June the 1st of 1944. This roughly correlates with the instances of several massacres, evictions, and atrocities upon Poles in the villages that surrounded his. As an ethnic Pole, even with any Ukrainian family ties, he would certainly not have been unscathed. In the ensuing aftermath of these events, any Polish identity of the region was effectively extinguished. Joe would have found himself among several homeless refugees, none of whom were untouched by the unimaginable scale of the violence. Even today, the painful memories of these massacres have been a cause for pain and division among Poles and Ukrainians, with Russia more than happy to exploit it for their own ends. A bright spot was that recently an agreement between the Polish and Ukrainian governments to exhume and reinter some of the remains has been reached. On June the 22nd, 1949, Joe departed from the German port of Bremerhaven aboard a United States military transport ship after having spent the previous years since the end of the war in a refugee camp. His classification as a displaced person was one that labeled him as someone unable to return to his homeland. In the years following the war, the United States government sought to resettle refugees by empowering relief agencies and charities based on the religious identity of the individual. Joe's sponsoring agency was therefore the National Catholic Welfare Conference, an organization credited with successfully resettling thousands of refugees over the ensuing decades. He was able to stay with an extended family when he arrived in Philadelphia and found work in a kitchen at the Methodist orphanage before relocating to Camden. He married in 1963 and seemed to live an uneventful life, passing away in 2010. Knowing him as I did at a distance, as the quiet altar server and sacristan, I never would have guessed that his experiences, which were offhandedly mentioned only as the invasion, may have been so potentially awful and traumatic. Although I had no way of knowing at the time, I find myself regretting not speaking to him to try and learn more of the story firsthand, as opposed to that gained only from research now that he is gone. If you take away anything else from his story and the others you hear, should you have anyone from this ever-disappearing generation in your circle that can be asked to share their story, be sure to do so. In the second half of the last century, as the organization of the American Catholic Church changed and evolved, the National Catholic Welfare Conference has now become the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, or the USCCB for short. In the decades that were to follow the war, the USCCB has been continually empowered by the U.S. government to resettle the victims of war and violence who had been displaced like the Poles we heard about. Though differing by ethnicity, place, and time, refugees have remained cut from the same cloth in their having witnessed things human beings never should have, and seeking sanctuary from the ravages of conflict and oppression. Sadly, this long-standing historic partnership with the U.S. government by the USCCB to resettle people such as Joe Sayetsky and thousands of others like him was dissolved earlier this year amid a flurry of controversy and baseless politically motivated accusations. Our final guests bring their World War II story from the same family. Regular listeners to our program and visitors to our tours at our historic church will probably remember Henry Shahulski, both from our March episode on St. Joseph's history, as well as the informative tours that he gives on these occasions, as the president of the St. Joseph's History Society. Together with Henry's older brother George, we sat and talked about their parents, who were, like Stella and Basha who we met, caught up in the war in Poland. The brothers, separated by a decade, were a window into their family stories that were revealed by their interaction. The next voice you will hear is George, followed intermittently by Henry and myself.
My dad was actually born in the United States. He was born in Trenton, New Jersey. Him and his brother and sister were born here. My grandmother took him back to Poland when Poland became a country again after the First World War. He always considered himself Polish. At that time, if you went to Trenton and you walked in that one neighborhood, you better speak Polish because you're not going to have a business. That's the way it was back then. Yeah, we lived in Włocławek, and when the war started, he joined the Polish army. He was captured by the Russians, handed to the Germans, from what I understand, and then he escaped from them somehow. And he got his paperwork done and everything else. He was in the Polish resistance for quite a while, from at least 42 to 45. And, that was, you had a bad time if you were ever captured out of there. But he wasn't, and likely he made it. He then was taken and sent to Germany and spent time in Gruyte, which is a suburb of Braunschweig. And he was sent there as a worker. My mother was taken off the street in Poland. She was at a party and then got caught on the street after the curfew, and then sent over to Germany and spent time, like my dad, in a labor camp. She was there, I think it was like 3 years she was there.
Was she kind of hesitant to talk about her experience as well?
She wouldn't ever talk about it. Both of them met in a displaced DP camp, which was always called the Dumpolak camp, a displaced persons camp in Germany. And they got married there. And that's where I was born. They had a tough time over there, And luckily, because my dad was actually born here, my grandfather signed for them to come back. So they managed to get them back to the United States then. This was in 1946 when he came over, because after the war, they were refugees. They weren't allowed back in Poland. He brought me up on deck, and I remember it was a foggy day. It was in early August or late August, and he showed me the Statue of Liberty. He said, "Remember that. That's what you're going to live by." And that, I was 4 years old at the time. That didn't mean anything to me, but now it does. My mom and dad came to Camden. My grandfather, I believe, had a lot to do with that. And it's funny because my grandfather and I did not get along. He was a very hard man. He was that hard-headed Polish guy. This is what it's gonna be, and that blah 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 blah. And that's the way it was back then. They were hard people, but they were good people. My dad used to tell me that it was tough going there. We got to remember, this is a time of McCarthyism too. Because he had an SKI on the end of his name, they sort of looked at him twice. But he said he managed to do everything. He managed to get a job, did everything right. I remember my dad trying to find a job here. And like I said, it was during the time of McCarthyism. And he had a tough time doing that because everybody looked at him a little sideways. We never forgot that. And everybody came over about at the same time, in the late 40s, early 50s. We all tried to help each other then. My father, after the war, wanted to go back to Poland because that's where his family was. And he wrote my grandmother saying, "I'm going to come back." This was like in 48, 49. And the grandmother said, "Don't come back. The Russians, the communists are looking for you." Because he was a resistance leader. And they were worried about that he might cause them trouble. My father's brother was in the resistance with him and got captured. His name was Tadeusz. He was captured and then put into a labor camp and then put into a concentration camp, and was killed there because he was a resistance fighter. That's what my father was mostly afraid of. That what might happen to him. Anything else that you can think of, Henry?
The only other thing is, we did lose Aunt Sabina in the war. My dad's sister.
Yeah, but
She's just
he went and tried to find her. His aunt. All they know is that she disappeared somewhere.
They got a
card from her.
A postcard from her saying that she was working on a farm. I think they put her on a farm to dig potatoes, and
she said she was happy because she had food.
Yeah,
where a lot of people didn't. The workers didn't. And then they never heard from her again.
I think she said she was feeling. It might have been that she was feeling sick, but that was the last that they ever heard from her. My dad said that area was bombed heavily by the Allies, but she just disappeared.
Yeah,
she was one of the great unknown. So I think that's part of the reason too.
Did he ever talk about his time either in the Polish army or in the resistance at all, or was he kind of didn't really want to talk about it?
My dad was like me. I spent 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. I don't talk much about it. He didn't talk, but he did say that he did talk somewhat about it. He did what he had to do, and that's the way he explained it to me. And now, when I got older, I understood what he said. You did what you had to do to get by. I admired him. My pop was my honor, my hero, because of what he went through. He, considering he came here, went there, came back again, he with his family, I admired him for that. You think about those things. There's bound to be some hard people. They had to be tough. Like I said, I always admired my father and mother because they were tough. You had to be tough to get through all that.
When he came back, was there groups that he joined that he kind of felt he could talk about things with? Just in the neighborhood. I mean, it's a very Polish neighborhood. There's all these associations. Did he
I
kind
don't
of
think there was a
find
whole
any
lot
kind
there because everybody there had tails. And at that time, you have to understand that this was the early 50s and maybe very early 60s. That everybody there had almost the same story. So it really wasn't that much. There were maybe exchange stories, but they never did it in front of me. So I really can't say.
Yeah, I think people didn't talk much about it because everybody suffered. So why complain about it? Because everybody else had the same experience.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. It was like me talking about Vietnam to somebody. Yeah, we all had the same experience.
It was typical Polish stoicism.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't see him very rarely get emotional about it.
I saw him get emotional one time.
Yeah,
One
but
time.
it was bad when he went to Majdanek, visited where
Yeah.
Tadeusz died. That was bad for him. That was a place that he would not go back
he was
to.
close to his brother? You think?
I don't think particularly so. I think, no, not really. But circumstances kind of brought them together. Yeah, and thinking about what you said, when Dad got away, he actually had to go to Warsaw because I think things were
Yeah.
hot for him
Yeah.
where our grandmother was living.
That's true. Yeah.
And he had to go to Warsaw, and that's where he hooked up with Teddy.
Yeah.
We have a photograph of them together in Warsaw. We didn't find this photograph until after our father passed
Yeah,
away.
the two of them were working down the street. There's Nazi soldiers behind them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Did he? I mean, again, he didn't talk a lot about it, but I think about that sometimes. What it was like, just walking down the street with German soldiers,
Well,
watching your every move, and just that fear of that constant.
I asked him what happened to Teddy, to Dad Tadeusz, and he really didn't tell me. All he said was that he was very brave.
he also said that he was
I think the word is reckless.
reckless. Yeah, there you go. I was looking for the word.
But the one thing that Dad did say to me was when you were in the underground, you had to be very, very careful
Yeah.
all the time.
Your dad told me that too, that Teddy was, I don't know if reckless would be the right word, but he just bull in china shop, go, that type of thing. And he looked at me and said, I know where you got that from.
What about, so, he was born here, and he went over and signed up for the Polish army.
He went over, and when he was about 11 when he went over there.
Okay. So,
Right.
yeah, so, I mean, how did, because again, like he was proud to be American, but he was also very proud to be Polish.
He was always Polish. That was his first thing. Even though he had spent his first 11 years here. I mean, I understand that his first 11 years, at that time, then, the Polish community in Trenton was very tight. You were always Polish first.
He was awarded for service in the 1939 campaign and
Right.
for his service in the Polish underground. Yeah, but he received we went up to the Polish consulate in New York.
And received the, it's funny, these things you forget, you don't think are important then, They're important now, what you're talking about. Yeah.
How did he feel about Poland after the war under communism? Did he ever talk about that? Like how he felt about the country, where it was going?
He didn't like it at all. As far as Henry?
No, he did not.
No. Henry, he didn't care for it at all.
Neither of our parents.
No.
I mean, I'm sure they didn't. I'm just curious how people who were Poles when they came here.
He didn't care for it at all. He just said, that we fought to make this country free, and now it's not. Basically,
Yeah, I think the real tragedy is for so many of the people from his generation that fought in the war really lost their country.
Yeah.
At the end of the war.
They call it the war Poland lost twice.
Yes, absolutely. You don't realize how they were sold out, And maybe they had to because they needed Russia to fight for them. But
Yeah, I think that was the one thing that Dad kind of came to terms with, because I had talked to him about that, and he said, yeah, he was really upset for a long time, but as he grew older, he kind of realized what the political situation was after the war. Um, he said England was a small country, and I think he kind of understood why that happened. It didn't make him,
didn't make it any better.
I mean, it certainly wasn't black and white either,
No,
and it was.
It didn't make it any better.
Yeah.
Well, there was one story he told me, and this may have had something to do with why he couldn't go back. A friend of him was a communist, and he said that his friend was in an underground group that was basically a communist group, and that they had come into the territory where his
I never heard this story. Yeah,
his group was there, and you kind of have to add, you kind of communicate with each other. We're passing through.
yeah.
We're here, and I think the guy's name was Leon. And because I tried to tell Leon, I've been to Russia. It's not that great. Things are really, and apparently an argument broke out between the two groups. He said he wasn't there. He's not sure what happened. But apparently Leon may have drawn a gun and they didn't give him a chance to use it.
Oh, okay.
So, that was, yeah.
Well, at that time, knowing what it was there and knowing what I had seen in other places is that you get two groups like that are very dedicated to their own thing, and now they butt heads and they won't give up. No one wants to give up. There was no consideration of the other side.
Yeah. And there's no plan after revolution usually.
No, they're right. Yeah.
It's the event happens and then it's like, now what? At this point in the interview, our discussion of the past unwittingly bled into the present. You may have heard George mention earlier his service in Vietnam. And as we confronted the realities of war in general in the story of his father, thoughts turned to the parallel experiences of it in our own time.
I didn't see a lot of combat. I was an engineer, so I either blew things up or I built them. I don't know if I wasn't a grunt. You talk to somebody in infantry, it was different than what I saw. But still, I saw a lot. I think about our buddy Dave. He never made it back. He was just, it happens,
Yeah.
Some things you don't want to talk about.
We have so like my generation now, I have friends who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Uh-huh.
One friend who lost his sight,
Yeah.
another friend with severe PTSD with shrapnel in his face. And it's, we've gone from World War II to Vietnam and to now. And it's like, we remember.
We're never out of a war.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it?
That's a damn shame of it.
Yeah.
That's the friggin' shame of it.
Yeah.
Never out of a war.
No. And it's like, now there's I think more support and understanding, but it's like there are documented cases of this going back to the Civil War, but it's still.
When I came home from Vietnam the second time, I was sitting in the San Francisco airport, getting ready to catch a plane to the United States, get back here to the East Coast. And this little girl came up to me, cute little girl, maybe 3-4 years old. I was in uniform, I had ribbons on and stuff, and she came up and she started talking to me, and I said hi to her and kidding around with her. Her mother came over, grabbed her. I said, "Don't you talk to him." And pull her away. And that just, my heart dropped. Hey, lady, I didn't do this. I was here. And it didn't bother so much then, but later on it did bother me. Yeah. I thought about it. It did bother me. When guys asked me about that. I was in a battle one time, and we got hit, and our outpost got hit. So we went out there, and they were laying dead all over the place. And it didn't bother, I said, hey, this is what happens. A year or so later, yeah, it bothered me. It bothers you. They can't say what they want, it bothers you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just,
But those things happen. Those things come. They're not only in my war, in Second World War, how many guys, from they saw 3 times what I did. And I don't say it doesn't really matter. It just, you see it once, you see it all the time.
yeah. It's like Stalin's quote, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic.
Yeah.
The worse it is, the more relative it
Yeah,
gets.
I read that quote somewhere. And
Joseph Stalin. I mean, it's
yeah.
that says it all right there. Yeah, it's.
You bring up a lot of stuff for you.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, that's okay. It's every once in a while you got to bring it up.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's because we're getting. I was actually talking to Stella about this. It's like the rate of people who are Holocaust deniers now, and things that happened in World War II that people have already not even learn about it in school, or they do, and they for whatever reason they think it's okay to say this didn't happen. This stuff needs to be remembered.
Oh yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Like, it's just awful.
Every couple years, I go to Washington, look at that wall. I got half a platoon on that wall. And you think about it. The guy that introduced me to my wife is on that wall, and I thank him for it every day.
Many veterans and refugees in our midst suffer, often silently, from the wounds of war. If you felt encouraged to aid these groups, many of whom have recently had vital funding cut, a list of volunteer opportunities and advocacy organizations can be found on our social media pages this month. At the onset of part 1 of our series, I'd introduced our topic by briefly mentioning the meaning of Polish months and how they mostly find their origins in natural elements. The word for September is wrzesień, which comes from the word wrzos, translated to the plant name known in English as heather. It traditionally covers the ground in Poland during September as the weather cools. Over time, this flower has been attached with deep symbolism across many cultures. It is characterized by its resilience and endurance, as it has an uncanny ability to thrive in harsh environments. It even has regenerative properties after brush fires. This has caused me to stop and wonder that as we reflect on the events of World War II, which first ignited in Poland in September of 1939, perhaps it is appropriate then that the Polish meaning of September's month reflects the rugged resilience that formed the hearts of these Poles, whose stories we heard had experienced the unimaginable terror of World War II and the successive wars until today. Each time we reopen these wounds by exposing these stories, it shouldn't be a pain without worth. In pre- and ancient history, stories were only passed down by their constant retelling. Only in that way did the dead remain alive, and their sufferings not forgotten. As we move forward into the 21st century, already a quarter old, and yet one which was born in the violence of 9/11, and has continued uninterrupted through that of war and genocide in Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, and dozens of other places at home and abroad, perhaps we should pause extra this September, consider what, if anything, we've learned from World War II. As Stella encountered in the remarks of her tour guide at Auschwitz, have we indeed moved on? The further we get from the horrors of its details, as seen so clearly in the stories you heard from and about, the greater the risk we run in allowing these stories to enter into irrelevance, losing the lessons that can for our own time, and causing the doom of their repetition. Yet, as many of you have observed, there were glimmers of hope and love within each story we heard. none of our families would have been resettled in peace without the charity shown towards the displaced victims from our government and a world eager to right the wrongs of such a war. Then there is the love and affection shown within each of these families to each other despite the wounds of trauma. A generosity of community and caring for the most disadvantaged existed in Camden, as well as countless enclaves across the country. And lest we forget the figures of clerics such as Monsignor Strensky, who advocated for their people not only within the confines of their churches, but within the institutions of government and community around them as well. Their advocacy can serve as a helpful model for the priests and leaders of our own time, who often struggle to find their voice in a world that seems increasingly deaf to their voices. As we strive to find the relevance in our own time and place of the stories of the past, perhaps the ultimate lesson here isn't just in working to never let the horrors of World War II repeat themselves, but also in seeking that even in spite of these horrors, working together to effect whatever good we can in our own communities. Conversion in our churches, families, and hearts is the call in every century and all their troubling times. Our Polish saint of the month is Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, Edith Stein. Or in Polish, Święta Teresa Benedicta od Krzyża. Her feast day is August the 9th, and she lived from October the 12th, 1891 to August 9th, 1942, or thereabouts. No one would have expected Edith Stein to become a Catholic, let alone a saint. Born into a prominent Jewish family in Wrocław, at the time the German city of Breslau, Edith once stated that she'd stopped believing in God when she was 14 and summarily abandoned any practice of religion. Gifted with an amazing intellect, Edith studied philosophy and obtained a doctorate in 1916. Yet the options open to her, given her sex and background, were mostly closed. Behind her academic brilliance was a lingering curiosity that ultimately found itself fulfilled in the hands of faith. After several positive experiences of Christian example, Edith found conversion from the reading of a book on the life of Teresa of Avila. In later reflections, it was due to her Jewish ancestry that she felt more bonded to Jesus. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Edith continued in her understanding of the Christian faith, into which she was then baptized and confirmed. She continued working in intellectual fields in German universities, including on subjects such as women's rights, psychology, and philosophy, all the while growing more deeply in devotion and understanding of her renewed faith, even at the expense of her relationship with her mother. In the early 1930s, she was accepted into a Carmelite convent, just as the dark clouds of Nazism began to swallow up Germany. The ensuing hell wrought by the Nazis and their doctrine of racial purity meant that Edith, now known as Sister Teresa Benedict of the Cross, was a target for elimination. Arrested in 1942 while in chapel with other sisters of her order, she was murdered in Auschwitz on the approximate date of August the 9th. Reflection. The cataclysm of the Second World War can rightly be understood as one of, if not the greatest failure in the history of humanity. So many stories, many of which will never be told, show the unimaginable level of evil that human beings have the capability of enacting on each other. For those of us that are Polish, the war is more acutely felt, since it is in our ancestral territory where it began, and many of its worst horrors were inflicted. The lessons of the war and their atrocities are ones that in some ways still have not been learned. The long tragic history of anti-Semitism was based on a distorted biblical interpretation. Jesus was first and foremost Jewish. He kept Jewish customs, celebrated Jewish holidays, and far from replacing the Mosaic Law, he re-verified it in his teachings. It is one of the greatest illogical fallacies of history, based on agenda-driven prejudices and fear, that our Jewish brothers and sisters were viewed with such inhumanity. Even today, anti-Semitic attitudes have seen a shocking resurgence in Poland, in which one would expect the very ghosts of its land to rise and wail against. In the United States, the rise of hatred, ultimately rooted in the same fear that drove the Nazis to such unspeakable crimes against humanity and against God, have seen a similar mainstream acceptance. In the face of these crimes, we can look at the lives of people like Edith Stein for understanding, hope, and remembrance. She was a woman of intelligence and philosophy who saw in her own DNA the ethnic kinship with Jesus of Nazareth. This is the same feeling that we as Polish have when we identify with St. John Paul II or St. Stanisław. That the same voices that would see Jesus separated from his identity as a first-century Jew are still given sanction is the second act in a great historical tragedy of humanity. As Christians, in the sufferings of our lives, we are invited to experience the sufferings of Jesus. Edith understood this to the extent she even saw her own trials in partnership with her Savior. For her, crucifix or gas chamber, 1st century or 20th century, the sufferings were the same. In reflecting on her martyrdom, perhaps we would consider who we may metaphorically send to Calvary or Auschwitz in the 21st century based on their status as the, quote, other. No matter if it's by race, religion, sex, creed, or ethnicity. Unfortunately, the lesson we most derive from this saint may be to realize that we are standing on the wrong side of God and history. Reflection questions. We look upon stories from World War II with sadness and regret at the worst of humanity. How can I work in today's world to ensure such actions are not repeated? How do I find myself complicit in persecuting the Edith Steins of my present time? Saint Teresa Benedict found a kinship with Jesus through recognizing their common Jewish ancestry. What examples of faith in my own ancestry, Polish or otherwise, can I look to for similar inspiration? Even as she was persecuted and taken away to a death camp, Saint Teresa Benedict never stopped praising God and finding grace in her suffering. Imagining myself in her situation, would I be able to do the same? If not, I take this to my prayer and speak with God about my relationship with Him. What insights do I receive? We hope that you have been as moved listening to our episode as we have been producing it, and that you will take this September, and every September going forward for that matter, to reflect on the lessons of Poland's experience during World War II. As always, don't forget to like and follow us on social media or drop us a line at pierogideprayer@gmail.com. And of course, visit us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at St. Joseph's, as the refugees of violence, war, and oppression have and found some measure of peace for over 100 years. Until next time, dziękujemy and thank you for listening. Instead of our usual sign-off and closing music, we will instead end with a sung version of the Polish poem and hymn known as Rota, or, in English, the Oath. The words of this hymn are a stirring commemoration of all that Poland is and hopes to be. The melody is haunting and the words just as moving. In this version, sung a cappella, I feel almost as though it is the voices of all those who have gone before us that have perished tragically in Poland's wars. While I invite you to find the full text of the poem, which we will post on our social media pages this month for your convenience, I will sign off with the opening words as translated into English. We won't forsake the land we came from. We won't let our speech be buried. We are the Polish nation, the Polish people, from the royal line of Piast. We won't let the enemy oppress us. So help us God. So help us God.